News. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Vali Nasr is here. He's Dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is also the author of The Shia Revival. From 2009 to 2011, 2 years, he served as senior advisor to the late Richard Holbrooke, President Obama's envoy for Pakistan and Afghanistan. Nasr describes his time in the administration as a deeply disillusioning experience. His new book is called The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in Retreat. Zbigniew Brzezinski writes about this book, an impressive toward the horizon and a sweeping review of the escalating geopolitical challenges the United States needs to address more intelligently. I am pleased to have Vali Nasr back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to be here.
You and I have had many conversations at this table, so now that you have written this book, you say the following, as we continue quoting, "My time in the Obama administration turned out to be a deeply disillusioning experience." So the question that arises is, what were your expectations, and why were you disappointed?
Well, my expectation was that the administration would be serious about engagement, about diplomacy, about reversing some of the trends that had emerged during the Bush period, and that it would really be serious about some of the strategic issues that were confronting the United States in Afghanistan and Pakistan and the Middle East. And given the turbulence in that region, it was necessary for us to take some serious changes in our approach, and none of these seem to be, in the end, on the administration's agenda.
And so you were disappointed. Yeah.
I was disappointed, largely. Yeah.
But you make several points here, and so I would assume the administration, upon hearing you say that, would raise the following points. We were not serious. We sent George Mitchell to talk to the Israelis and the Palestinians. We had long reviews of Afghan-Pakistan policy. We called in a range of experts. We listened to both military and political people. We considered a whole range of options. Isn't that being serious?
No, because on issues like Arab-Israeli issue or negotiations with Iran, we talked a lot about talking, but there was no real political capital or no skin put in the game by the administration. The White House did not back George Mitchell. It really did not push either the Israelis or Palestinians for a peace process. With Iran, we remained very content with sanctions. We were not serious about an actual negotiating process, and I don't think we are at this point either. We're asking Iran to give up all of its nuclear program, and in return, all we offered were aircraft parts. I mean, even in the last meeting in Almaty, the question is, what is it that the United States is offering that actually would make this negotiation serious? Being serious means that you actually put something on the table around which the other side can negotiate.
Fine. What would you put on the table?
Well, specific sanctions attached to specific things that you want from Iran. If we want Iran to sign the additional protocol to the IAEA, what specific sanctions are we willing to give in exchange for that? If we want Iran to suspend enrichment beyond 5%, what specific sanctions are attached to that? After all, the sanctions were put in place to bring Iran to the negotiating table. The sanctions' objective was not to get a full surrender from Iran without us giving anything. If that's the objective, we could easily say it will never work. In other words, we have not put on the table something that would capture the other side's attention. As duplicitous and as indecisive or as difficult as Iranians may be when they come to these negotiations, the question is, what is on the table for them to actually consider? And there isn't. There isn't anything.
Suppose what you would suggest putting on the table. We will lessen the sanctions if you do this. What do you think they'll be prepared to do?
Well, then the negotiation actually begins. Then the give and take begins. That are you willing to do X in exchange for Y? Is this adequate? Would you want more? Can we give less? That's actually comes the back and forth about negotiations, the nitty-gritty. But in reality, just saying that we're ready to talk doesn't mean that we actually are serious about talking.
So you put more, you have more criticism for the American position than you do the Iranian position.
Well, I think, we charted this course. We said that our strategy is two-track strategy of pressure through sanctions to get them to the table to negotiate. So we have to actually be willing to support our own strategy. They didn't come up with this strategy. They're the subject of this strategy. So we say our sanctions have worked in the sense that they're under pressure. They've been back. There have been 4 rounds of talks. And in these 4 rounds of talks, we have not put anything on the table that would make these negotiations serious. So in reality, this is not to say that the Iranians are easy to deal with or that they are ready to sign a deal. But the question is that what do we really mean by the 2-track strategy? Is it just sanctions for the sake of sanctions? Or is it that sanctions would support some kind of a diplomatic initiative?
Do you believe that they have an intent to build nuclear weapons?
I think I think they're at a decisive decision point. I think their national objective now is to get rid of sanctions. If they cannot see a way to get rid of sanctions through negotiations, they will look at the North Korea model and see that they have a lot more leverage with nuclear capability or nuclear weapons than without it. They are watching how the North Korean leader is brandishing his nuclear capability in order to exact concessions from the outside and to prevent further sanctions and maybe relieve sanctions. That to them would look very, very attractive. So the key question is at this particular juncture, do we encourage Iran to think about a possibility of getting rid of sanctions through negotiations, or they come to a conclusion that, look, the Americans and the Quartet are just not going to lift these sanctions regardless of how many times we go. There's nothing concrete on the table. Maybe if we get the bomb, they will get serious.
This is also about American foreign policy. You make a lot of interesting points, and I want to read another one. This is, the president had a truly disturbing habit of funneling major foreign policy decisions through a small cabal. I mean, cabal is a loaded word, of relatively inexperienced White House advisors whose turf was strictly politics. Their primary concern was how any action in Afghanistan or the Middle East would play on the nightly news, on which talking points it would give the Republicans. You really believe that? That the people who were deciding American foreign policy was a small cabal of relatively inexperienced White House advisors? Secretary of State did not have, in your judgment, any role in foreign policy, either the priorities or the execution of foreign policy?
She did, but it was often after fighting or going to the president directly. But generally, the view of the White House was that policymaking would be centralized in the White House in a small group around the president, that he's the chief strategist for all of America's foreign policy. And the various agencies of the government, State Department, Pentagon, etc., their job is merely to implement. Policy making coming from the State Department was not welcome. I mean, I witnessed that firsthand with Afghanistan and Pakistan. That was the reason why Richard Holbrooke had so much trouble with the White House, because he wasn't there to just take marching orders from a group of young advisors of the president who had come from the campaign to the White House. He actually thought he had something to contribute. And every time he thought that idea that he had to contribute, he put forward, that was when, you know, the pushbacks came. And the difference was that many others may have basically accepted the way things were. He decided that he had a duty essentially to bring his experience, and he would push and push. And the secretary defended him, and many times they would go directly to the president, and some things moved. But ultimately, the White House was set up organization in a particular way, that decisions are made at the very top, and then the agencies of the government are there to merely implement it, and the State Department's job is essentially to implement the policy that's decided in the White House.
Well, you certainly speak with authority in terms of that, because you were very close to Richard Holbrooke, and you were one of the many brilliant and young and committed people he brought into government to work with him, an extraordinary staff who enormously dedicated him, and you represent the best of those. And your great grief when he died was evident to so many of us. He also came to this table and many times expressed the idea that we weren't using diplomacy, that sort of the military was in control of policy making in those regions where he had. And he tried hard, in a sense, to assert the role of diplomacy.
That's right.
Do you Why do you think he failed?
I think he failed because, first of all, it had to do with the fact that he really wasn't given access to the president.
And why was that?
Well, I think that's exactly because, as I mentioned, the way that the foreign policy approach was set up. He was not one of the inner circle. They were the ones who would make the decisions, were closest to the president, would be the gateways to the president as to what options he would consider. And Holbrooke was in the State Department and was kept away from the president. I think also there was a sense early on that this is a young democratic president. The military's come out of Iraq very triumphant with a strategy of counterinsurgency, that ultimately they're going to go with what the military wants in Afghanistan. And Holbrooke talking about that maybe diplomacy should be at the forefront and the military should support diplomacy, an idea that the military was not very keen on, would be merely unnecessary static. But I also think that he failed because philosophically the administration is not serious about diplomacy. It viewed the risks that diplomacy would entail, dealing with the Taliban, dealing with Pakistan, and I think it extends to dealing with other issues like Iran, was not something they wanted to spend, or they wanted to accept those risks. And Holbrooke believed that we should use the military in Afghanistan more judiciously. Don't put so many troops, because the more you put in, the faster you're going to withdraw. Treat Afghanistan as a marathon, not a sprint. Put enough troops that Pakistan, Iran, and the Taliban would take you seriously, but you can also stay there longer, and then use the military to get people to the negotiating table around the deal. Whereas the view of the military and ultimately the White House became that the job of Holbrooke and the diplomats is to support the war. They're supposed to go around the world, get money and troops for the counterinsurgency, and then focus on growing pomegranates and fixing electricity in Afghanistan. They really didn't want to go down the path of looking at Afghanistan as, negotiations with North Vietnam and Viet Cong in Paris, or as the Dayton Agreement. They really didn't see the diplomat as the two-ton elephant here that's going to be managing the end game to this war and shaping the regional peace when we leave. They thought that the diplomats should play a secondary role. And I think that became really the reason why he failed. He could not convince the administration that he should be given the same importance as the military commanders of the war, and that the administration should see the end of this war as happening around the negotiating table, and that we should not try to win this war, and we actually have come to that conclusion now that we can't, but that we should leave a settlement behind us when we leave that would bring all of the region around a deal that would give a semblance of order when we leave. And now we're leaving Afghanistan without that. We have not won the war, and we have not arrived at a peace deal with Afghanistan. We're simply handing over a military mission we couldn't finish to this Afghan security force we're training.
Some will also argue that the State Department effort did not succeed as well as they thought it would be to build up the Afghan government, to increase governance, to try to force the Karzai regime to deal with corruption. All of those were responsibilities in part that Richard Holbrooke had to do that. You know that there had been much discussion about his relationship with Karzai. According to Rajiv Chandrasekhar's book and debate, he wrote in his book, Little America, Karzai told his aides that he did not trust Holbrooke and did not want to see him again. His aides conveyed that message to officials at the U.S. Embassy. This occurred in the middle of the debate over AFPAC policy.
Well, yes, Karzai could say that because he knew Holbrooke's boss didn't have his back. Yeah. Karzai would not have dared, whether he liked what Holbrooke told him or not, to pick on Holbrooke if he hadn't got ample signal from the White House that he's expendable. Before Holbrooke took on Karzai, Vice President Biden said the very same things to Karzai and walked out of a dinner, just got up in the middle of a dinner and walked out. But Karzai would not countenance sending a similar message about Vice President Biden to the embassy. So partly, you know, Holbrooke had a tough job of getting the Afghan government to behave. The Afghan government very early on understood that it can say no to Holbrooke without any consequences. And in fact, many in Washington very much liked Karzai bad-mouthing Holbrooke because they wanted to use that against Holbrooke. And in reality also, again, the point you make, it is not the job of the State Department to be doing governance. That's a sort of a lower level job. The State Department was being pushed.
It was part of.
Because
let me ask the question. Not you can tell us whether I'm right or wrong. It is my understanding that part of Richard's responsibilities.
It was. Yes, you're right.
Was exactly that.
Right.
But that was what he was trying to do, and that was what, by the way, he was good at.
Well, but with one difference. The State Department was put in charge of doing the civilian side of counterinsurgency as a junior partner, but that's not what he really wanted to do, and that's not what the State Department should have done. The State Department should have been in charge of finishing the war on diplomacy, not growing pomegranates, not doing rule of law, not doing governance. Essentially, this whole strategy was concocted by the military as counter.
You know, I would assume. Well, the president would hear that and he'd say this strategy was not exactly concocted by the military. The president was pushing for alternatives. If you read Bob Woodward's book, I mean, he constantly sees the president pushing for alternative
but
options.
He was never given alternative options. Ultimately, the strategy is the one that was devised by the military in Iraq. It's counterinsurgency.
No, okay.
So ultimately, there were two options before the president.
So they sent Petraeus over to replace.
Well, McChrystal also, but even before that, McChrystal was implementing the same strategy. In Woodward's book, the president considered only two strategies, which was a fully resourced counterinsurgency, which is Iraq transfer to Afghanistan, or what the vice president advocated, which was called the counterterrorism plus, which is we leave the fighting altogether and rely on special forces and drones to target Al-Qaeda inside of Pakistan's northwest frontier. A diplomatic option, which is what Richard Holbrooke wanted, was never actually one of the options the president considered. He could have considered it and rejected it. But he didn't consider it. It was not. You read the book. There is no mention of a third option, which was Richard's option, put far fewer troops on the ground and aggressively and actively look for a diplomatic solution, which would have made Holbrooke and Secretary Clinton the principal actors in managing the end of the war.
I mean, she had a powerful voice in the conversation. So if Richard Holbrooke's ideas were rejected, that is a rejection and a failure of Secretary Clinton.
That is a rejection and failure it's a rejection of the State Department. I wouldn't say it's failure because they did all they could, including direct meetings the Secretary had with the President to put these issues on the table. Ultimately, it is the National Security Council that decides the agenda of the meetings and the options that the President has before him. Now, it's also up to the President to tell his staff that he's not happy with these options and he wants other options.
So how would you characterize the National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon?
Well, he was a National Security Advisor at the time. It was General Jones was there. But ultimately, and it's not only one of them, it's actually a circle of people that I think included also people who were running the campaign, who had come from the campaign, who were very conscious of how the whole strategic review would play out in domestic politics.
We're talking about Rahm Emanuel. Who are we talking about here?
It's a whole cabal. I mean, it's a group
who
of.
Are they?
Well, it's from Dennis McDonough to David Axelrod to Tom Donilon to Plouffe, etc. That ultimately decided.
Plouffe was not in government at that time.
No, but they all had. But those who were in the White House, that they had the decision ultimately as to recommendations that come from the different agencies of the government. Ultimately, what ends up being an option that the president would consider and then would ask questions for and would then go to the relevant agencies and say, what does it take to resource this? How long will it take? What are the results? But that wasn't there. As I said in Woodward's book, it's very clear there are only two options on the table.
Okay, here's what's important. This book, Dispensable Nation, America's Foreign Policy in Retreat, suggesting that no longer are we the indispensable nation. We are, in fact, the dispensable nation, American foreign policy in retreat. A lot of people, and this is a very important point to make, a lot of people who think seriously and deeply about foreign policy, whether on the pundit or journalistic side, like George Packer, writes for The New Yorker, an original and powerful and provocative critique of American foreign policy under President Robert Kagan. The George Kennan of U.S. Vali Nasr is the George Kennan of U.S. policy in the Middle East, a renowned scholar but also a practitioner and insider who served 2 years in the Obama administration, delivers a smart, sharp, sober, fast-paced, and absolutely riveting critique of the policies. And Anne-Marie Slaughter, an important wake-up call by a thoughtful, astute, and deeply knowledgeable scholar. I mean, anyone interested in the Middle East and China or the future of American policy should read it. Having said that praise to you, tell us what you think we ought to be doing.
Well, I think we ought to take our role in the world, and particularly the Middle East, I think is very critical, not only because we spent a decade there and made the Middle East essentially the marker for our global role, but I think also many other countries around the world, in Asia, for instance, where we want to focus, are looking at the way we're approaching the Middle East, the way we're washing our hands of it, the way we are treating its crises as an indicator of the direction of our foreign policy, how serious we are, how much investment we're making in foreign policy, how much they can trust our strategy. This is something we have to pay attention to. When you go to the region, it's very clear to people in the region that we do not want to lead in this region. We are not engaged with the Arab Spring, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Syria, whether it's Yemen, Libya, that we want to do less. We want to reduce this region's importance in global politics. The president even compared Syria to the Congo, saying, you know, it's just as important or not important as the conflicts in Congo are. And the message that comes across very clearly is that we don't want to be indispensable in this region, and by implication also maybe more broadly. And the region is beginning to look at us as dispensable. So we packed up and left Afghanistan. We surged 1 year. Then we started a withdrawal the following year. We are not engaged in Syria in a meaningful way, not only militarily, but in terms of even humanitarian support and diplomatic leadership. We're not engaged with Egypt, whether it's economically or politically. And I think all of this, suggests that we are sending a very powerful signal internationally about how do we view our global leadership. I mean, in America, people characterize this as leading from behind. But in the region...
That was based on one quote.
No, I agree.
During the Libyan.
No, I agree. But it's become actually much more than one quote. It's become actually the way people see that we have a wait-and-see attitude.
What would you have the United States do in Syria?
Well, I think we have to we first of all have to send a signal that we are serious about this conflict, that we do see an American interest and a regional interest in this conflict. It's not just an humanitarian tragedy, that this is the place where the future of the Middle East is going to be decided. If the United States, even before doing anything, sends a signal that it doesn't see a country that's going to be shaping the future of the Middle East as something worthy of its attention, that's extremely telling. We could begin by getting very serious about humanitarian support. The size of the refugee problem can cause the collapse of Jordanian social order and economy, can deeply impact Lebanon, it can impact Iraq, it can impact Turkey. We are not really providing much support, and we're not leading the international community in providing humanitarian support. We have to get much more serious about diplomacy. Even within the Syrian opposition, the chaos that is between the Saudi faction and the Qatari faction has completely debilitated the opposition. We're not taking a position of actually bringing order to that. We need to work on a no-fly zone, not only because it's important to stop Assad's butchery, but also because it's important for the refugees to stay within Syria and not destabilize the neighboring countries. And I think being engaged with the rebels on the ground is important, because the direction that Syria is going, it's becoming a failed state with Al-Qaeda fiefdoms within it that ultimately is going to threaten our very security, and we need to take all of these very seriously. I think the very first thing everybody wants to hear from the administration is an articulation of why Syria matters to the United States. What is our interest here? Other than wanting a dictator to go and a tragedy of a humanitarian crisis end, how does the United States see its interest in Syria? That's not even articulated. And there are also parts of the US government that have argued that this is going to be another Iraq and we shouldn't get involved. But I think whatever the internal discussion is, clearly the message is not coming out that the United States takes this sufficiently seriously, or is willing to actually get engaged, or has a pathway for ending this conflict, or see an end to it. Often what you hear is that Americans show up to meetings in the region on these issues, but they're not really engaged, and they are not leading these meetings. It's usually the United States the one that has, even despite sometimes resistance on the ground, articulated why certain conflicts matter, why it's important for, say, the Syrian opposition to get its act together, why it's important for Saudi Arabia and Qatar to set aside their rivalries. I mean, this doesn't require a major commitment of US troops. This is actually fairly low level. It is important if the United States were really right at the forefront of helping the Jordanian government provide for the 500,000 refugees, which may become 1 million in that country alone by the end of the year. So, the way this debate is unfolding is that it's either we're going for total war, or we're not going to even put our toes in the water. And when you put it that way, the general tendency is to say, well, okay, we're not going to put our toes in the water, at least not yet. But the cost of Syria keeps going up. At some point, we're going to have to get involved, and by then it would be much more difficult and costly to manage it. And then at the same time, it's also damaging our standing in the region, because increasingly in the Middle East and beyond Middle East, the sense is that countries have to take care of these issues on their own, and that can also be dangerous to us. I think we should have learned from Afghanistan that when you let others give arms to rebels, then you lose control of where that arms is going. I think it would have been much better if we had given arms to the Mujahideen during the Soviet war, rather than let the Pakistanis do it. And we're making that same mistake now in Syria.
The dispensable nation, American Foreign Policy Retreat. I invite our friend Vali Nasr to come back anytime. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.